This episode of Spectre Creative is brought to you by sandpaper. Sandpaper, when you just don't want your paper to be soft. So today on the Spectre Creative channel, we're going to be talking about Star Trek, the other big space franchise action figure line. Other meaning, from Star Wars. But Star Trek was there first, and Star Trek had toys aimed at kids way back in the 1960s. Kids were enthralled by the idea of a space crew flying around boldly going where no man, woman, alien, or action figure could go before. In the 1970s, Mego dominated the market, with their Star Trek figures being one of their key brands. And even today, some of the best Star Trek action figures ever are being produced by companies with the likenesses and articulation better than ever before. But you can't talk about Star Trek toys without talking about the powerhouse license that was Playmates in the 1990s. Starting in 1992, Playmates Toys acquired the license for Star Trek and created a line that became a game changer for the industry in ways that, they probably never even intended. But sometimes the best laid plans have unintended endings. Everything from playsets to figures to vehicles to roleplay. Playmates embraced the line full on. They wanted this line to be something outstanding, and it was. They had figures from untapped Star Trek properties like the current movies and the movies from years past that had never had figures made for it. And they even had figures based on the new TV shows coming out. In fact, during its reign, some of the best Star Trek shows were actually just hitting the airwaves and could be show to shelf 1-to-1, which is kind of the goal of every toy company. One of the things that made the Playmates line so amazing was the fact that all of the Star Trek figures were in scale to each other. No matter what the time, no matter what the medium, movie, original series, they all worked together. Unlike the original toys that came out in the 60s that were just aimed at kids and, let's face it, weren't exactly Star Trek authentic. I don't quite remember all the times that Spock was jumping out of the Enterprise with a giant parachute. I don't know, maybe I just haven't watched enough of the original series. But either way, the lines that came out in the 60s and the 70s were toy lines that were primarily aimed at kids. While we as adult collectors in the here and now look back at these lines with nostalgia and often large wallet prices, at the time, the Mego line and the few figures that preceded it in the 60s were squarely aimed at the kids. All of the role-play items were kid-sized, the figures had bright colors, cloth outfits, and, they were the epitome of what an action figure was in the 1970s. Of all the licenses that Mego had, Star Trek was one of its premier brands, so much so that it got one of its first playsets with the infamous Transformer spinning feature. The final figures that Mego cranked out were shrunk down to 3 3/4 because, as I said, that other space property, which came along in the late 70s, early 80s, created the 3 3/4 as the definitive scale. But after that was about it from Mego. Great films like Wrath of Khan never had action figure lines to accompany them when the movie was out. But of course, all of that would change in 1987 when the second Star Trek TV sequel, the first sequel turned into the movies, but The Next Generation aired, which took place 100 years after the original show and literally told the story of the next generation. Playmates Toys, which at the time was known for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles line, which was quickly becoming the dominant boys action figure line in the toy aisle, decided that, now that Star Trek was back, maybe it was time to revisit this license, and essentially they decided to double down. While Ninja Turtles was doing great, you never know how long the lifespan of a toy line is going to be. Sometimes toy lines last for years, other times they just fall apart and tank when you least expect it. So, in 1992, the world got its first new Star Trek toy since Mego had stopped production with Star Trek the Motion Picture. And they were really awesome. They came on incredibly colorful cards with a focus on the new IP, the next generation, the new show, and all the characters were in scale to each other. They was sort of a new scale. It was a little bigger than Star Wars, but a little smaller than 6-inch figures. And while the accessories were mostly unpainted and in one monocolor plastic, which comes from molding it in one color, they were still embraced by fans because, well, it made the entire show come to life in action figure form. And from the figures to things like recreations of the Bridge playset, everything you needed to basically step into the world of Star Trek The Next Generation was being replicated in plastic form by Playmates. And Next Generation was just the tip of the iceberg. Once the line started going, Playmates turned its eye to previous Star Trek incarnations, including the original series, where they cranked out figure after figure of the original cast and their enemies, as well as some of the movies that had been skipped, like the fourth mentioned Wrath of Khan. Here, Khan got his very first action figure ever from Playmates. Amazing that such an iconic movie villain had never been captured in plastic form before. And again, as I noted, all of the figures, no matter what IP they were from, what iteration of the franchise, they were all in the same scale. And as new shows like Voyager and Deep Space Nine rolled out, Playmates was right there to do the entire cast, as well as tons of variants, background characters, aliens, guest stars, and, well, basically, they wound up doing over 350 individual figures by the time their run was over, which is pretty monumental. What set them apart and what was really a game changer was recognizing the unique aspect of Star Trek. They aimed it not just at kids, but deliberately at collectors. The Playmates Star Trek line was the very first toy line ever produced that was done so with the adult collector in mind. There really even wasn't a thing called an adult collector at the time. In fact, the idea of making toys for adults was a really new and groundbreaking concept. It would still be several years until Star Wars embraced this, although they first put their new line out also aimed at kids. It wasn't until they realized that adults were a major part of their audience that they turned the Power of the Force 2 line into also an adult collector line. And then, of course, you can't talk about adult collector figures without mentioning Todd McFarlane and his Spawn line. But again, this line was aimed at the adult collector, and this was just being established. When the Star Trek line came out in 1992, the idea of making toys for adults was unheard of. Why would an adult want toys? Yeah, some adults collected toys, but to actually produce them aimed at this audience? And this is because there was a brand new play pattern that came out. It was called souveniring, which was an entirely different play pattern altogether.
An entirely different kind of flying altogether.
It's an entirely different kind of flying.
So what is souveniring? Well, it comes from the fan base. Star Trek already had a history of embracing the fans and had been holding conventions for years, if not decades at this point. And while there is no doubt there were children that were coming to these conventions and were fans of Star Trek, coming out dressed as their favorite characters, showing their love, by far the majority of the attendees for these shows were adults. And when adults buy toys, they don't buy them to, well, play with them and have adventures on their living room floor. They buy them to remember their show and or movie. And now while Star Trek preceded Star Wars as far as a sci-fi franchise, and there's often disagreement among the fans over which one is better, when it came to toys, while children really embraced Star Trek toys in the 1960s, by the time you get up to the modern era, well, Star Trek fans had gotten older. Because Star Trek was out earlier, your fan base for Star Trek, compared to something like Star Wars, was generally a decade or even 2 decades older, which meant that these fans were not playing with the toys, they were displaying them. And that's where souveniring comes from. The idea that you are buying an action figure to remember an experience, be it an experience watching a show, an experience going to a movie, an experience going to a convention. The figure represents a memory, and having that figure is recapturing that memory, hence souveniring. So even though Playmates made action figure playsets and vehicles that were clearly, if you will, from first glance aimed at children, they were really embraced by the adult collector way more. In fact, the proof is in the pudding about as far as Star Trek appealing to kids versus the adult collector. It's almost a good thing that Playmates had doubled down and specifically aimed their line at the adult collector, because, well, by the time the new Star Trek movies were launched under J.J. Abrams, well, again, the same strategy was taken, where they aimed them at adults and kids, but by this time, kids weren't interested at all. In fact, Playmates had put out multiple different scales of the same characters from the movie in hopes that one of them would appeal to kids. They knew, collectors would always buy. But sales were so bad that by the time the follow-up sequel came along, Into Darkness, well, there really wasn't much interest in having Star Trek toys for children. Obviously, collectors would continue. Hasbro scooped up the license for the second film, but they never actually produced much. A lot of their plans, while they showed it to retail, well, retail wasn't interested in putting it on their shelf. They still had so many toys from the first movie that it was almost like crickets at retail. They just had no interest in putting more Star Trek product out there for kids. But kids grow up, and the adults who were fans of Star Trek were enough to keep it alive. While there wasn't as much of a kid interest, there was still an adult collector interest. And part of this with Playmates comes from what was a bit of a happy accident. While they were aiming the line at adults, they kind of went a bridge too far with one series. And that was the 1701 set. So this was 3 figures that Playmates put out kind of in the middle of their run, the middle of their heyday, where the figures were limited to 1,702 units. And for those of you not Trekkies at home, that's the call number of the Enterprise. So you could only find these toys if you really hunted for them and looked for them. And this is really the set that ignited adult collector interest in toy collecting. Adult collector interest in, boy, that just sounded terrible, but you know what I'm saying. So in addition to the Picard from Tapestry figure, this set also included Lieutenant Barclay, who eventually was re-released and done in a higher production unit of 3,000 units because of fan demand, and Lieutenant Yara, who, while she left the show, eventually did come back, and a flashback figure, if you will, of her was made in the 1701 line. Well, while they had the best intents with doing such a super limited line, it didn't go over that well with collectors. And hello, the Jean-Luc Picard tapestry figure is not even correct to the source material. If you watch the episode, The Tapestry, you will see that he is dressed in a Starfleet uniform but does not have the white collar. This is clearly just a kit bash, which it was. The Picard figure that was so desired by so many collectors was actually Picard's head on a Kirk body from Generations. If you go and you actually look at the episode Tapestry, you will see while he wears this uniform, he doesn't have the neck piece coming out. It was just this Kirk figure, which is also a beefier body, with a new Picard head. So what became a very inexpensive product figure to actually produce became one of the most demanded action figures of all time, especially at the time. While it makes sense from a marketing standpoint to limit something to 1,701 units, because, that's a Star Trek number, there were way more fans. And what started off as a gesture to embrace the adult collectors that they saw were coming on board the line, the plans kind of blew up in their face. There's other toy lines that have done limited editions, and have done limited editions tied into specific numbers, like the 1,985 units of gigawatt, hence 1985 for Back to the Future. And there have been toys that have had limited editions that have just had enormous runs. The 25,000 units of all silver Wolverine, which, because there's 25,000 people out there that want this. So it's gone both ways. But the 1701 Star Trek set was notorious for being underproduced. So much so that they had to bring it back as a 3-pack, allowing collectors to fill in the gap. And while they may not have had the single carded versions, having an incomplete collection is something that drives collectors crazy. I know, because I'm one of them. That figure that you just can't have, that's out of reach, it's kind of like that itch that just won't go away. So while you might not be able to have the carded single releases, at least that box set gave you the figures if you wanted them loose, and you could complete your collection. And boy, what a collection it was. If Playmates hadn't thought about the adult collector, they would have never had the success they did with Star Trek. In a way, they kind of created a monster. Being the first toy line that was directly marketed and sold to adults, well, it really spawned an entire industry. Where we're sitting today, where we have R-rated properties made as action figures, and we have collectors demanding reproductions of figures from their childhood with more detail and more articulation, as well as new form factors for beloved characters. So if you want to collect by the character, you can get them in almost everything from a Pez dispenser to a Funko Pop. And all of this is really going back to Playmates' Star Trek line. Because they embrace the adult collector as a key demographic for their success, they spawned an entire industry. Knowing that Star Trek fans were a little older, well, that became a good thing for them. And that knowledge and that foresight helped the line become a true classic and really spawn an entire industry, which we're all part of today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, leave a thumbs up or a subscription because it tells YouTube to share it with other people. Leave your comments below, any questions or suggestions, and I'll be sure to answer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.